So I'd like to think that we finished 2022 off on a good note, and I would like to start 2023 off on a good note as well. And in my last video of last year, I introduced my late grandfather's John Deere 520, one of the new additions to the collection, or re-additions, I should say. And I realized it was pretty foolish of me not to tell the story, the awesome backstory and the history on this tractor, as well as how I was able to track it down and buy it back after so many years. So without further ado, this video is dedicated to this tractor and, of course, to my grandfather's memory. And I think you guys will like the story. So I'm going to put in some video clips from the day that we picked this tractor up and brought it home, and some pictures of the restoration project as well. So according to the two-cylinder archive records, this tractor was shipped on July 10th, 1957 to our local dealership, which would have been, at the time, Merle Foster Equipment in Elmer or Poole Tavern, New Jersey, which was in the heart of South Jersey vegetable country. And it was only fitting that the tractor was built with a single front wheel, with the longer rear axles that allow for up to 104 inches of tread spacing, and then the special offset or dished 42-inch rear wheels with 12.4 by 42 tires, or back then they would have been considered 11 by 42. This particular tractor was also outfitted with hydraulic remotes for operating, individual front rock shafts, a 3-point hitch, and PTO, of course. And then this one in particular was shipped without the float ride seat, which was a new option for the 20 series. It was just basically just a shock absorber to allow for a more cushy ride. But this tractor, to my knowledge, was shipped without it. Now, in the time period that this tractor was built, southern New Jersey was the East Coast powerhouse, I guess you could say, for fruit and vegetable production, thanks to, sandy loam soils and its proximity to both New York City and Baltimore, which, as we all know, are two major shipping points for a lot of our goods in this country. And New Jersey actually even rivaled California when it came to produce. But regardless, most of the farming done in New Jersey was for row crop fruits and vegetables, and as a result, many of the tractors that were shipped to New Jersey were set up for these conditions. Now, row crop high clearance tractor, in many different and unusual configurations like you see here, they were sold all over the southern part of the state, and they were often used for cultivating crop beds, side dressing or top dressing fertilizer, and in a lot of cases, the larger ones also found work doing other tasks such as tillage or planting. That was the case with the 60 here. And back in the day, international harvester high clearance tractors mostly dominated the area. Even today, it's not unusual to see multiple Farmall AVs, Super AVs, or 140 high crops being used on farms. And my grandfather and great-grandfather owned multiple AVs and Super AVs throughout their time farming. In fact, when my great-grandfather began switching over to tractors during World War II and getting away from horses, the very first tractor he ever purchased was a Farmall AV to cultivate with. And then when my grandfather broke off, bought his own farm and started farming about a decade later, the first tractor he bought, or one of the first tractors he bought, was an AV as well. And the AVs were good tractors, and they worked pretty well for their size, at least, in that particular area. But they were only capable of cultivating like one row at a time. So as you can imagine, that got old pretty quickly, especially when my grandfather began expanding his vegetable operation. And in 1958, he decided to look for a larger and more capable tractor to cultivate his rows of tomatoes and peppers and squash, among a bunch of other vegetables. Now, 2 years prior, he had traded in his very first tractor, which was a John Deere A, on this 60 that you see here. And the 60 became the main workhorse on the farm. And he decided to see, what Deere could offer him in a cultivating tractor to kind of complement the 60. And he wanted something that would compete with the AV as well. So he wasn't looking for something quite as big as the 60, but something that had, that was a little bit bigger than the AV, I should say. Something that could cultivate more than one row. He then demoed a 420 John Deere vegetable tractor with a set of 2-row mid-mounted cultivators that would have been, similar but a little bit more capable than the AV. And the story actually goes that some of the field test engineers from the local John Deere branch house, which I guess would have been Baltimore, came down to the farm with the salesman to try and work with him to create the proper setup for his tomato and pepper fields. But he had a lot of difficulty getting the cultivators on the 420 to perform the same way they did on the AV. And I can remember him telling me how the Farmall cultivators were designed in such a way that the tractor would kind of pull them along, which would allow them to track straight down the row, which, is what you want. Ultimately, that's due to the design of the shanks and the way that they mount to the main frame of the cultivators. And From what he told me, the cultivator or shank design on the 420 cultivators allowed the tractor to sort of push them, which would cause them to spread apart over time, and they required constant, readjustment. And at that point, they were just costing him time, and the new 2-row setup would have been about as efficient as the 1-row setup that he was used to with the AV. So he decided to continue his search, and I seem to remember him telling me that he had tried cultivating with the 60 for a short period of time, when he first had it. And I've mentioned it in the past, but this tractor had a single front wheel originally, when the first couple of years that he had it. So he, had a set of cultivators on this tractor for a little while, and I honestly don't know what model cultivators they were, but I know he could do up to 4 rows depending on the crop. And he decided to keep the cultivators that he had used on this tractor, and he also kept the same remote front rock shafts that had been used on the 60. And, like I said, the 420 didn't work for him, and at the time he couldn't afford a brand new 620 or 630 tractor because it just would have been, the same size as the 60. So he needed something that was in the middle, and he settled for a 520. So by this point in time, the 520 tractor you see here, which is serial number 7801, was about a year old, and we're not sure whether it may have been used as a dealer demonstrator tractor like the 60 was for like a year or a year and a half, or it may have been purchased by somebody and then traded in after a short time. But regardless, it ended up on the lot at Haynes Equipment, which was a John Deere dealer in Medford, New Jersey. And my grandfather went to look at it. The dealer gave him an offer he couldn't refuse, especially since it was I guess you could call it like a low-hour used tractor, and it was 1 year old. And he took the tractor home. And this tractor would spend the next 30 years or so on my grandfather's farm, cultivating endless acres of tomatoes, peppers, and other vegetables, about 4 rows at a time, all season long. My 3 uncles, my great uncles, and even a few of the hired hands all cut their teeth on this tractor, as well as the 60. And my mom even remembers riding on it as a little kid as well. With the cultivators, the 520 wasn't just used for weed control, though. It was also used to cultivate dry fertilizer and pesticides into the soil. My grandfather did a lot of that back in the day. Every spring after the fields were plowed and disked by the 60 or one of the other tractors, one person would run down the field with the John Deere 50 that we had, planting tomatoes or peppers with the custom 4-row transplanter, and the hired hands help. And then another person would follow behind them on the 520, dropping fertilizer and then cultivating it into the newly planted rows. And that's basically what this tractor did for the majority of its service life. You spread that out over 350 acres of vegetables, give or take, and nearly 30 years of service, and it was bound to rack up a lot of hours. I mean, the same can be said for the 60. And it might seem far-fetched, but I actually happen to have my grandfather's old cash book here on the bench that he used to use to keep service records in, starting in 1968. And you can see I have it open to the page for the 520 here. He was pretty particular with his service records, if you can't tell. And as a matter of fact, he actually used the same book to keep maintenance records on all his vehicles up until 2018, the year before he passed away. Now, if we look close here, starting in 1968 when he started putting records in this book, it looks like the 520 had 3,625 hours on it at that time. And if we run the math, it would indicate that this tractor had somewhere between 9,500 and 10,000 hours on it by the time it was retired, basically when the service records ended, so it would have been like 1984 or 1985, because I know 85 was officially his last year. So it would seem the stories of the hours are true, and I ran the numbers for the 60, which are on another page, and they also check out. Of course, 10,000 hours is a pretty long service life for one of these old girls, and you're never going to be able to make it to that point without having to do some, work here and there, whether it be an overhaul or, repairing something. And if we look in the service record here, you can see that it would appear that in June of 1972, the engine was rebuilt, bored out to 45 thousandths oversize, and then had new main bearings and rings installed, and the whole 9 yards, as my grandfather would have said. And it also looks like the clutch was rebuilt that same year, and then if we fast forward to 1976, you'll see a note there, repair transmission completely. So, not 100% sure what that entailed, but my point is, aside from those couple of overhauls, it looks like mostly regular oil and filter changes, spark plugs, and points were all this tractor really ever asked for of my grandfather. And if you look close, you'll also see that as the tractor got older, he got to be a fan of using STP. I guess back in the day, that was what everybody swore by. Of course, the 1980s saw the downfall of many small American family farms, and unfortunately, my grandfather's farm was no exception. His last official year farming his own ground was 1985, like I mentioned before, and in the following years, he began renting the ground out to other local farmers while his own equipment just sat parked, and weeds began to grow up through everything. And like I mentioned before, this tractor was retired and parked sometime around 1984-85, and my grandfather was not one to get rid of things, and he did try to hang on to as much of his farm equipment as possible. Of course, that was before my grandmother passed away in the mid-1990s, and then he was making plans to sell the farm in the late 90s and early 2000s. And at that point, he was forced to choose which things he wanted to keep and which were to be sold. And as most of you guys who watch my channel know, he ultimately decided to keep the 60 and the Ford 4000, which is totally understandable, as these were his main workhorses. I mean, this tractor here and the 4000 were the ones that he would jump on and go use pretty much every day, because they just got used for so many different tasks around the farm year-round. But I can remember talking to him about the 520 several years ago, trying to piece together the story on it, and I seem to remember him feeling pretty remorseful about selling it. He would always say how good of a tractor it was and how well it treated him. Now, sadly, I don't have much of a memory of this tractor when it was still on the farm. I think I remember seeing it parked in the weeds way off in the distance when I was real little, but it's a really vague memory, and I certainly don't remember which year he sold it. At this point, all I know is it was in very bad shape when it left, and we were without it for at least 20 years. And when it came time to sell out, he sold this tractor to a fellow farmer friend of his, Carl, from northern New Jersey, who also happened to be a collector. And the story I'm told is that he basically sold it to the guy for scrap value, and all of the special equipment, including the three-point hitch, the cultivators, the single front wheel, the front rock shafts, all that stuff had went with it. He sold it as a package. And supposedly it had been parked with calcium chloride in the tires for so long that when they went to move it and load it on the guy's trailer, both rear rims actually broke apart. It's not the first time we've run into that issue. I mean, moving the 60 around my uncle's property the last couple of years, we basically ran into the same thing. That's why I had to put another set of tires and rims on it just for the time being. Now, there have been a few conflicting stories regarding whether the tractor really was complete when my grandfather sold it. I mean, everybody in my family who I've asked seem to remember it being sold complete with the cultivator still on it. But the story that Shane was given was that it had been taken apart by a few teenagers and was never put back together, like it was a project that was never finished. So I'm not sure if maybe one of my young cousins at the time tried tinkering with it, or some tweaker might have come on the farm and tried stealing parts off of it for scrap, or maybe the buyer, Carl, or one of his people took parts of it. We may never know for sure, but regardless, the 520 here ended up being used as a parts donor in its next life, and over time the valuable parts have been taken off and either repurposed on some of his other tractors or just sold outright. And by the mid-2000s, there was very little left of this thing. It had pretty much been reduced to a frame, engine, and transmission with axles, and its fate at the scrapyard was imminent. And over time, my grandfather had gotten out of touch with the friend who had bought the tractor, and we eventually found out that he had passed away, so our chances of being able to find it and buy it back someday were slim to none. But unbeknownst to either of us, the tractor was given another chance at life, and this is where the story gets really good. So it turns out that in the fall of 2006, Carl was getting ready to scrap what was left of this tractor, and he had listed it in some of the major classified ads, such as Lancaster Farming, Green Magazine, and Two Cylinder Magazine, sort of as a like a last-ditch effort to try and sell what parts were left on it before he scrapped it. And I happen to be a long-time subscriber to Green Magazine. I have issues dating back to 1996, so I got curious one day, and I pulled out the issue from December 2006, and sure enough, I was able to find Carl's ad, which listed assorted 520 parts for sale in New Jersey. So I thought that was kind of cool. Now, Shane, a very knowledgeable collector and restorer, and who's gotten to be a good friend of mine here in Lancaster County, PA, he had a pretty lengthy history with the 520s and 530s. He had owned and restored a handful of them, and he had seen the ad in Lancaster Farming. He was looking for a donor tractor to use for parts for some of his projects he was working on at the time. So he saw the ad, he took a trip up to North Jersey one weekend to inspect the stripped chassis, and he was hoping to salvage any usable parts. And when he got there, he was pretty disappointed in what he saw and was getting ready to walk away. But then he noticed the long rear axles and the heavy-duty rear axle housing, and he immediately realized that it was a vegetable tractor. And he saw potential in it, and he quickly changed his mind, and then he decided to purchase the chassis and took on the duty of bringing it back to life. knowing very little of its history or origins. And the story goes that Carl actually ended up hauling the chassis down to Shane when he was making a trip down to Lancaster County to buy some hay equipment one weekend, so it worked out pretty good. And for the first time in its life, Shane had brought the chassis off of Carl's trailer, hauled it into his shop, and the tractor finally got to live indoors. Now, given the rough condition of the tractor, which, as far as I can tell from his pictures, was in much worse shape than the 60 even looks right now, doing a proper restoration was going to involve tearing it down to the very last nut and bolt. And truthfully, that's the only way to do a restoration. That's how I intend to redo the 60. And when you redo a restoration, you have to make sure every component is brought back to the same condition as when it left the factory, even if it means finding all the right, correct, and proper parts to do so. So, over the course of about a decade, Shane made every painstaking effort to do this. He basically had to track down every part that had gone missing from it, and I have to commend him on this because he could have just slapped some weathered 520 sheet metal and the traditional, the very common Roll-O-Matic dual front wheel setup on it and called it good. But he knew what this tractor was, and he was dedicated to giving it a thorough and proper rebuild and putting it back the way it originally came. So he sourced a good straight hood for it and a decent nose cone, which had some dents. It's not too unusual to see on these two-cylinder tractors, especially the ones that have some hours on them. But with a little bit of body work, he was able to get it straightened out. And also, the nose cone was missing a little piece of metal towards the back edge here below the 520 decal. And he actually had to cut a piece out of a wrecked nose cone from a 50, and he welded that piece in place here to fill the gap. And you wouldn't even know it unless you really looked at it close. So that's a true testament to his craftsmanship. I mean, that's just awesome. So as you can imagine, the engine and a lot of the internals were seized up from holding moisture for so many years. Now, he was able to remove the block and disconnect the rods from the crankshaft, but he couldn't get the rods and pistons out of the block because they were just stuck tight. And at that point, the best way to free everything up was to just take it apart and use brute force. So he actually stood the block up on a press, and he used a large piece of pipe to push down on the pistons until they broke loose. And as you can imagine, the cylinder walls and the pistons were not in good shape at that point from holding moisture all those years. So he ended up having to bore the engine out 125 thousandths oversize, which is the largest you can go with these old gas two-cylinder blocks. Now, he did get lucky that the crankshaft actually looked okay, and it polished up pretty well, and the splines on the ends looked good. That's another thing you have to look out for with these two cylinders, especially, I mean, it's more common on the diesel models, but the gas ones, especially the 60s, they were sort of notorious for stripping the crankshaft splines. But he said the crank in this one looked good. But everything else was polished up, cleaned, resealed with all new bearings, gaskets, and main seals. And over here on the other side, the clutch and the reduction gear assemblies were all rebuilt as well. New clutch linkage. I mean, those usually wear out after so many thousands of hours. And according to my uncle, from what he could remember running this tractor, the clutch linkage was actually worn so bad that the lever wouldn't even snap into place to engage like it's supposed to. The 60 is actually worn the same way. Like that one, that's got so many hours on it, you can't snap that clutch lever in place. It will not hold. So that should give you an idea of how many hours these tractors had on them both. So, nonetheless, regardless, all of that had to be remachined and built back up again. In the transmission, Shane had found that several of the gears had teeth that were worn pretty bad, which probably isn't too surprising considering the hours that the tractor had on it. But at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the record in my grandfather's service book here for repaired transmission would have omitted replacing the gears, because back at that time it would have been real expensive to replace all the gears that were worn. Now, Shane also found that one of the counter shafts were worn beyond spec, so he sourced a good replacement one out of a 50. But I think the most noteworthy part of this transmission and rear end was probably the one axle shaft that he had to replace. Not repair, but replace. So evidently, when the transmission was repaired or rebuilt back in 1976, somebody replaced the cone bearings on the axles, but I'm guessing they probably used an aftermarket bearing that was not an exact fit, because Shane said one of the bearings was a loose fit on the axle shaft when he took it apart, and it had actually worn major grooves in the axle shaft over the course of, I guess, what would have been like 8 or 9 years from the time that the transmission was redone to the time the tractor was parked. And Shane actually decided that it was more practical to find a replacement axle shaft rather than try to rework the original one. And I know some of you are probably wondering why. But the issue is that with these, longer axles especially, they're super heavy and they're a larger diameter than a traditional 520 axle shaft. And because of that, they put a lot more stress on the carrier and the bearings, especially with all that extra weight sticking out past the end of the housing. And while it's not impossible to machine one of these shafts back to new spec, it would be very difficult, trying to get it balanced just right, and also making sure not to apply too much heat in one area, because obviously that'll, significantly weaken the axle. And it isn't unheard of for these axle shafts to break off right at the housing. So Shane was determined to find a good used axle, which is like finding hen's teeth, because again, there weren't as many tractors built with long axles to begin with. So you figure 65, 70 years later, there are even fewer out there now. And also, while the long axles were preferred for vegetable farming, they were kind of a nuisance in most other applications, because they made the tractors so much wider, which made them more difficult to store and less likely to fit through narrow doors and gates. And unfortunately, for that reason, a lot of farmers just resorted to cutting the axle shafts off with a torch just to shorten them up. And at that point, there's no saving them whatsoever. So many of the already uncommon long axles met their fate this way, which makes the search for a replacement axle shaft that much harder. Even through this dilemma, though, Shane did manage to find a good used long axle shaft out of a parts tractor out west and sent it back to PA to be saved and installed in the 520. And, sometimes that's just what it takes to do a proper restoration, so I have to give him credit for that. You might also notice that the tractor is sporting the old school Goodyear 45-degree bar tires on the rear. And believe it or not, these are actually period-correct tires for a tractor built in the 1950s. And as you can tell, these are actually in excellent shape with very little dry cracking or wear for their age. Now, this tractor would have most likely left the factory with the 45-degree Goodyears like these when it was new. I'm told that these tires had a very long production run, even into the 1980s, when they become a popular choice for high-wheel sprayers, which most frequently would have been in the 38-inch or 42-inch size. And they also became a popular option for our smaller garden tractors. Every once in a while you see an older John Deere, 200 or 300 series running around with the original Goodyear bar tires still on it, the 12-inch size. You might notice the tread pattern with the diamonds on the sidewall. It's the same basic tire. As part of the restoration, Shane opted to find a set of period-correct tires to put on this tractor, and while they're not impossible to find, trying to find a pair of them in good condition like these is definitely a challenge. In order to get two good tires for this project, he actually had to buy two separate pairs of tires along with rims which had been removed from sprayers. And the story he told me was he ended up taking the one good tire from each pair, dismounting them, and then remounting them on one good rim from each pair. And, if that's not dedication, I don't know what is. He really went that extra mile just to make sure that this tractor had two good rims and two good, 45-degree bar tires. I think these tires really complement the age of the tractor, as well as Shane's attentiveness to small details. As much as I love the look of newer tires like Firestones or Carlisles, it's hard to beat a true original look. And it's pretty satisfying knowing that this is basically, for the most part, exactly how this tractor would have looked coming out of the factory. Another thing I have to commend Shane on is his willingness to try and preserve and reuse, as many original parts from this tractor as he could. The parts that were on this tractor back many years ago when my family owned it. Initially, when he did the restoration, he swapped over a good pair of brake drums and pedals to replace the seized drums and pedals that were, originally with the tractor. But he had kept the originals just in case. And to make a long story short, after I had agreed to purchase the tractor off of him, he went to the trouble of disassembling both sets of drums and swapping over the original pedals, painting them up and everything to match. These are the same pedals that my grandfather, my uncles, and basically everybody in my family would have used years ago to help stop and steer the tractor. That little detail just made the deal so much better for me. Like I said before, anyone can swap over parts from donor tractors, but the real restorers are the ones who take the time to save the original pieces as best they can. So these are just a few of the nitty-gritty tasks that Shane had to go through in order to bring this thing back to its former glory. Of course, he went through the rest of the tractor and disassembled everything in order to fully bring it back to, like new condition. The cooling system, the fuel system, the power steering, the governor all had to come apart. and he also had to source the rest of the pieces to put the 3-point hitch back together, since most of the pieces were missing at that point. The only thing he did not disassemble in this tractor was the power troll hydraulic control valve, which is calibrated at the factory, and that calibration, from what I'm told, is not something you want to mess with, so he left it alone. But everything else on this tractor was wire wheeled, primed, painted with several coats of genuine John Deere ag green and yellow paint, and slowly, carefully, and painstakingly pieced back together over a period of several years. Now here's another sign that this restoration was done the right way. So if you look closely here at the back edge of the nose cone, you will notice that the yellow paint stops before it tapers to the inside there. And that is actually correct for a 20 series tractor. Now originally, these tractors left the factory with a yellow decal applied to the sides of the hood. The yellow was not actually painted on. It was painted on the wheels, but not on the sheet metal. So that came from the factory as a decal, and the decal did not wrap around that trailing edge there. It stopped, at the side, and Shane made sure to duplicate that when he painted it. Obviously, when he redid the tractor, he painted the yellow instead, but he wanted to get it as close to factory correct as possible. So he stopped the yellow paint right there at the edge, and then you can see where it goes green again. He also handmade the 520 decals as close to original as possible, and that is some, the shadowing and everything was done by hand, and that is some true dedication right there. I mean, I just can't get over how good that looks. I mean, looking at it at a quick glance, you would never know that it wasn't a factory printed decal. I know for a fact, like I said, it never had the float ride seat, and he just put a standard seat on it when he did the restoration. And I should also mention that he installed a new old stock yellow seat cushion as well, which, judging by the only picture I have, this tractor did originally have a yellow seat. So he even got that detail right. I mean, that's just awesome. That's not an aftermarket replacement cushion either. That is a true NOS John Deere seat. I wonder how many of those are still out there, because there can't be many. Shane also installed a new old stock John Deere oval muffler to help quiet the exhaust on this tractor. Now, the oval mufflers were offered as a factory option for the 30 series, but not the 20 series, at least to my knowledge. And like I said, this one that he installed on it is a new old stock oval muffler. The way to tell them apart is that the new old stock, the original John Deere mufflers have a short inlet pipe coming up off of the main mounting flange. The aftermarket ones have a taller pipe, so the muffler itself actually sits up a little bit higher. So, like I said, this is a true NOS John Deere muffler, not an aftermarket replacement. But as you'll see, I have the muffler off the tractor now, and the reason for that was because it didn't give me enough clearance to fit through my 7-foot garage door unless I took it off every time or I had somebody stand there and push the door up while I moved it in or out. Now, like I said, that muffler is not... it's not technically incorrect for a 520, but it's also, I know for a fact, judging by the old picture that I have, it's also not the muffler that this tractor would have had originally. So I decided to put the correct, 520 cylindrical shaped muffler on it. Now, someday when I have a bigger shop and taller doors, I would like to find an OEM cylindrical muffler. It would be nice to find an NOS one. I'm sure there's a few of them out there still. But for the time being, I had to settle with an aftermarket Stanley muffler, as you can see here. And in order to make it fit in my shop here, I actually had to cut the flange down. I had my buddy Carl, who's a pretty good welder. He cut it down and shortened it up and re-welded it for me just to give me enough clearance to let it fit underneath the 7-foot door without rubbing. And like I said, when you consider what this tractor had on it originally, I know this is more correct. I'm not going to get rid of the NOS muffler that was on it, though. I'm going to keep that for a future tractor. I'm hoping to maybe buy a diesel 2-cylinder someday to put that on. I know that'll help quiet it down a little bit. But I did end up having to switch the muffler out just to make sure it was correct. Then if you look at the dash panel here, you'll see that Shane installed a new dash panel without the tack or hour meter that goes in the center. Evidently, this tractor did have one in the past, judging by the hours noted in my grandfather's maintenance book. So one of these days, I would like to find an NOS 520, tack or hour meter and install it. But right now, I'm still looking. So all in all, it took almost a decade for Shane to acquire all the parts and to finish the restoration of this tractor. After about 30 years of silence, he got the engine running again in the spring of 2015. And he had finished all the paint work and had the tractor back together that summer, just in time for the Waterloo Boys John Deere Days event over here at Rough and Tumble that July, which I posted videos of in the past. Now, that would have been the very first show that this tractor ever attended. I know for a fact that my grandfather never would have had it at any events, back when he owned it, because it was, always being used on the farm. And he typically didn't do that kind of thing with his equipment. So it made its grand debut at John Deere Days 2015, and then Shane brought it home, and he parked it in his shed where it would basically spend the next few years tucked away. He would start it up a couple times a year and would drive it around the block just to keep everything fresh and keep the fluid stirred up. But for the most part, this tractor barely even saw enough runtime to break the new engine in after it was rebuilt. Now, a 520 with a single front wheel isn't necessarily rare, per se. And I guess you could say a vegetable configuration like this one isn't very rare, at least where I come from. I mean, I know of at least 3 other 520s in South Jersey that were set up pretty similar to this one. Not exactly, but very similar. But this particular tractor has a couple of odd features that really make it stand out. Like I said before, single front wheel, longer rear axles with the dished 42-inch offset wheels and the 3-point hitch. But I think the most interesting of those would actually be the rear tires. And like I said before, these are 12.4 by 42 Goodyear tires, which back in the day were considered 11 by 42. And if we go over to the bench here, I happen to have a copy of some of the production records for the Green Dash 2-cylinder tractors, so the 20 series up until the end of July 1957, which happens to be the month that this tractor was built. So this would have been one of the last Green Dash 520s built before they switched over to the Black Dash models for 1958. Now, these numbers were recorded by Lyle Cherry, who, to my understanding, was the sales manager for the John Deere Waterloo Tractor Works back in the 50s, when these were being built. And at that point in time, John Deere Corporate had basically done away with keeping, individual build records for each serial number, which would have listed any special options they were equipped with at the factory. Basically, their records had gotten less and less specific over the years. Now, through the 2-cylinder club, you can get a serial number research done where they look up your serial number in the Deere archives, and they send you an official notarized document with the info they find. And I have done that for both of these tractors here, but they both just come back listed as row crop, gasoline, power steering, nothing too specific. Now, if you have an older letter series tractor and you get one of these research documents, you might notice it will have more equipment listed, but that's rarely the case with these later numbered tractors, unless it was like a special order. So it's my understanding that while he was the sales manager, Lyle Cherry actually took the liberty of recording every individual option that these 20 series tractors left the factory with, or at least as many options as he could find. Now, like I said, unfortunately, these numbers are only accurate through the end of the 56 and 57 Green Dash models, and evidently this was one of the last Green Dash 520s built. Now, if you look over here to the left, you can see just how specific his options list got to be, like how much he was able to narrow down his criteria. So let's look a little closer here. Up at the top, gasoline, 7,299 produced. Power takeoff, 7,608. Power steering, 7,399. Load depth with 3-point hitch, 5,316. Single front wheel, 484. This is where it gets a little more specific. And then long rear axles, 333. But then we come down here to the bottom section, which lists tire options, and this is where it gets really interesting. So like I said, the original serial number research document did not list the tire sizes it came with from the factory, and when Shane bought the tractor, it obviously had no tires or rims with it. So when he was doing the restoration, he had to try and guess what size tires this tractor might have originally had. And when I showed him, once I got to know him and I showed him the grainy picture of the tractor on the farm from 1979, he seemed to think that it may have left the factory with 9.5 by 42 tires, which back in the day were considered 9 by 42, as you see there. They have a shorter sidewall. Now, of course, that was a pretty crappy picture, and it was taken from a distance, so the tire size can be kind of hard to judge. But if we look over here in my grandfather's maintenance book, you'll see that on August 8th, 1974, he replaced one 42 by 12.4 tire. Not both, just one. Now, I know for a fact my grandfather was not the kind of person to just randomly change tire sizes if he didn't have to. I mean, obviously, it wouldn't have made sense to replace a bad tire with one that was a different size. He wasn't one for installing bigger tires like a lot of pullers and collectors do nowadays either. But I also know for a fact that this tractor would not have worn through tires as quickly as the 60 did. This 60 here being a tillage tractor and being the everyday tractor was always wearing out tires. He was always replacing tires on it. And The 520 just being a cultivator tractor, obviously that wasn't going to be the case. It would have been much easier on tires. So that means, going by my grandfather's service record there's a good possibility that this tractor may have originally had the 12.4x42 or, 11x42 tires from the factory. And if we look all the way down here at the bottom of Lyle Cherry's list, you'll see that as far as the green dash 520s go, only 2 520s actually left the factory with 11x42 rear tires. Like I said, this is only good through the end of the 1957 model year, but if this is correct, there's a possibility that this is one of only 2 520s that left the factory with 11x42 or 12.4x42 tires. Now, of course, we'll never know for sure because the records for, total 520 production are not there, but it's very, very possible. But, we do know that it's at least one of 484 green dash 520s with the single front wheel and one of 333 with long axles. And it certainly makes for a good conversation piece, and it gives you something to think about. I suppose that configuration alone would be enough to call this tractor rare. Now, you're probably wondering how I managed to track down this tractor and bring it back into the family so many years later. So my grandfather passed away just shy of his 91st birthday in October 2019, and as you can imagine, this came as a major hit to our family. He was the glue that held us all together, and we just knew the world would not be the same without him. And we were all hoping for some kind of, spiritual sign from him, letting us know that he was still there with us. And back when he was farming, he was known to save pretty much any documents that had to do with his vehicles and equipment. Unfortunately, most of those documents had perished in more recent years, and we kind of figured everything had been lost when the farm was sold and the old house was demolished. But while we were sorting through his estate, I actually discovered a few of those papers had survived, and they were receipts from the New Jersey DMV dated March of 1971, when he had gone there to register all of his farm equipment for road use that season. Because back in those days, New Jersey required farmers to register and tag their tractors for road use. I mean, evidently they've done away with that in more recent years, but at that point in time, all of his tractors that ran between different farms and different fields had plates and registrations, and for whatever reason, he kept most of the registration receipts from 1971. Now, one of these receipts was a registration for a tractor that did not list the model, but it did list it as a John Deere with serial number 5207801, which I immediately recognized as a 520 serial number. After years of believing the 520 was gone and not having any documentation with serial numbers listed, you can imagine how thrilled I was to find this small piece of paper. I wanted to see if there was a slight chance it was still out there, so I went out on a limb and I posted the serial number and a brief description of the tractor on several Facebook groups, along with a rough picture of the tractor on the farm from 1979 that I had to filter and crop several times just to make it easy to see. And to my knowledge, it's the only picture we have of that tractor, back when we owned it years ago. Well, wouldn't you know it, just a couple of weeks after I shared the info online, so this would have been December of 2019, I got a Facebook message from Shane's brother who had seen my post on one of the John Deere groups, and he recognized the serial number right away. He shared the info with his brother to make sure it was the same tractor, and then he gave me Shane's email and encouraged me to reach out to him, so I did. And Shane and I exchanged a few emails back and forth over the next couple days. We got to know each other. He filled me in on some of the details of the tractor, along with the backstory he got from Carl, which, for the most part, matched the story I was told by my grandfather. And at that point, I knew we were talking about the right tractor. And I asked him if he still had it and if he would send me some pictures of it. So he sent back the 2 pictures of what it looked like when he first bought it in 2006, when it was just a rusty chassis. But he didn't provide any other information than that. And at that point, I was just amazed that the 520 was still out there, even after, I had thought it was gone all those years. And it turns out he had actually seen a couple of my YouTube videos, oddly enough, and he knew that I still had my grandfather's 60 and was planning to restore it, because at that time, I had just posted a video of that tractor that past summer. And I asked him if I could buy the 520 chassis off of him just to keep, put away for the future as a restoration project after the 60 was done. And he replied back with pictures of the tractor all restored and sitting at the Rough and Tumble show in 2015. And you can just imagine my reaction when I first saw those pictures. To say I was blown away is a total understatement. And I just couldn't believe it. I knew at that very moment my grandfather was still there with us, and that was the sign I had been waiting for. And I shared the pictures and the story with the family, and they were just as amazed as I was. Now, like I said before, it's one thing to find a surviving family heirloom like this, but it's another to find one that's been completely restored to new condition, especially, after missing it for so many years and not knowing whatever became of it. Now, Shane and I continued emailing back and forth, and at the time, he assured me that he wasn't ready to sell the 520 yet, but he would give me first dibs on it when the time came, and he wanted to see it go back to a good home. So I kept it in the back of my mind for the next several years. So fast forward to February of 2022, about a year ago now, I got an email from Shane telling me he was thinking of selling the 520, and he wanted me to have first dibs on it. He was true to his word. And again, you can imagine my reaction. I mean, I was just beyond thrilled to have the opportunity to buy it back. I was thrilled that he remembered me, and it just so conveniently happened that I was living in Lancaster County, not far from where he and the tractor were. And it just seemed like all the pieces fit together perfectly, and now it was time to bring the 520 back into the family. So, a couple weeks later, on my birthday actually, my girlfriend and I stopped in to meet Shane in person and actually see the tractor up close. And at the time, it was tucked away in the back corner of his shed, out of the light and out of the elements. So we basically discussed the entire restoration process. He showed me a bunch of pictures of the process, which you guys are seeing in this video. And he was more than happy to hook up the battery, turn the gas on, and let me start it up. And even though it had been parked for a while and it was pretty cold that day, it didn't take more than a few revolutions before she fired up. And at that moment, it really felt like a reunion with my grandfather in a way. It was almost crazy to think that this was the same tractor that he had bought nearly 70 years ago, and the same tractor that my mom and her brothers grew up on, or at least one of them. And needless to say, that made for an awesome birthday. So Shane and I worked out a payment plan, and we came back another time or two to visit in the spring and summer months while I worked on trying to get some of my other tractors sold and get some space freed up here in the shop to store it. And then finally, July 16th was the day that this tractor got to join the family again. So we headed over there with the truck and trailer. That was me, my girlfriend, and my friend Jimmy. And my uncle also drove up from New Jersey to meet us there at Shane's place. And they got to know each other. They started sharing some stories and looking all over the machine. My uncle helped him fill in all the missing details, at least from what he could remember. And we had to slide the rear wheels in about 3 to 4 inches just so they would be narrow enough to fit in between the fenders on my trailer. Now, I do have the drive-over fenders, but parking the tractor on top of them just wouldn't be ideal for all the hauling I plan to do with this thing. So we narrowed up the wheels, got her loaded up and hauled back to my house here and got her in the shop, and now she's back in the family again. And like I said before, in my last video, I had it at a couple shows this past summer, including John Deere Days over here at Rough and Tumble, the Nittany Antique Machinery Show up at Penn's Cave, it's near State College. And I also brought it down to its old homestead in South Jersey, my old family farmstead, or what used to be family farmstead, where this tractor lived and worked for so many years. The homestead and the tractor both look a little bit different now than they did 30 years ago, but it was one heck of a homecoming, let me tell you. And I also drove it around some of the back fields that my grandfather used to farm and that my uncle now farms, just for old time's sake. It really felt like home, and it was a great way to kind of christen the restored tractor on its home soil once again. So as I mentioned in my previous video, my long-term goal is to be able to bring this tractor to many different shows and parades in our area, and maybe even some of the big John Deere shows out west if I get the chance. Like I said, vegetable tractors are more of a coastal thing, so the further away you get from the coast, the less common they get, and the more interest they seem to bring at shows. And the restoration done on this tractor is just too perfect not to show off, and in my opinion, the story behind it and its resurrection really make it worth showing and telling. And I think it'll make a great companion to the 60 once that tractor gets finished. And I would like to be able to take them to shows as a pair someday if I can. And, maybe if I'm lucky, given my track record, maybe I can track down my grandfather's other two-cylinder tractors that he used to own, the A and the 50. I have no way of tracking them, unfortunately. I don't have any serial numbers, but, maybe there's some more hidden documents I haven't discovered yet. But regardless, I'm a little hesitant to put this tractor to work doing anything more than, driving around or pulling like a wagon or giving my little cousins rides on it. It really just seems way too nice to use. Although, then again, I do have my grandfather's old John Deere Model 44 plow, two-bottom plow, sitting in the weeds back in New Jersey. That would look pretty good painted up, behind this tractor. But I don't know. It might see a plow day in the distant future, but definitely not anytime soon. It's always risky using a low production model like this to do any actual work when they get to be this old, because you just don't want to scratch the paint, you know, let alone damage or hurt anything. So there you guys have it. That is the story of my late grandfather's 1957 John Deere 520 tractor, and you know, the story behind it and how I was able to track it down and buy it back. I know, like I said, my videos have been sparse, you know, over the last half a year. You know, a big part of that was trying to take all the steps that were necessary to me purchasing this tractor and making room for it here. And I have some video footage from some of the shows I had this tractor at last summer, including Rough and Tumble and the Nittany Show, and also driving around, you know, on my old homestead back in New Jersey, which I'm going to do a separate video for that, I think. But I'm excited to post that for you guys to see. And this tractor does run, I promise. I know I haven't shown it in this video, but you guys will get to see that in the next couple videos. So I am more than excited. I mean, I'm just blessed to be able to have bought this tractor back, to have gotten to know the man that saved it, the man that restored it, and to just have learned so much about these two-cylinders that I, you know, didn't know already. I used to be into the two-cylinders years ago before I got into garden tractors, but, you know, as a little kid going through school then, it just, you know, wasn't practical for me to get into collecting these, so that's kind of where the garden tractor addiction started. They were cheaper, smaller, and easier to store and collect. But now it's time to move up to the bigger and better toys. So now, of course, that I have this 520, I have even more inspiration to get the 60 looking just as good, and that is my goal. So we will, you know, we will use this as an inspiration here. And, you know, for years I've said that this 60 was pretty bad, and a couple people have tried to tell me that it probably can't be saved. But trust me, if you saw what the 520 looked like before it was restored, I mean, that should be a sign that anything is possible. And, you know, I'm excited to see what comes out of this project now as a result, and I just can't wait to see these two together. So anyway, I think that's where we're going to leave it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to showing this tractor off in many future videos for you and letting you guys hear it run. So thanks for watching, and here's to a happy and healthy 2023.